In my line of work, you got to keep repeating things over and over and over again for the truth to sink in. In my line of work, you got to keep repeating things over and over and over again for the truth to sink in.
That science should be guiding our decision on what dispersant to use.
Some dispersants are safe. Corexit is not.
Trade-offs. 436,000 gallons of dispersants already dumped into the Gulf. Another 800,000 on order. It's the same dispersant used on the Valdez spill, after which cleanup workers reported health problems, including liver and kidney disorders. Now, Greenwire reports that BP has released monitoring data from as recently as June 29th. Results of testing its cleanup workers and finding that 20% of offshore workers and 15% of nearshore workers had 10 parts per million of the dispersant solvent called 2-butoxyethanol, twice the toxicity limit of 5 parts per million dictated by the CDC's National Institute for Occupational Health and Safety. More than 47,000 people are working to clean up the spill right now, and because one way to get exposed to 2-butoxyethanol is to breathe it.
And that's what that Corexit does. It ruptures red blood cells, causes internal bleeding and liver and kidney damage. So this stuff is so toxic combined. It's not the oil alone, the dispersant alone. It's the dispersed oil that still contains this stuff. It's very, very toxic, and it goes right through skin.
Dr. Susan Shaw is a marine toxicologist.
According to this is the second worst dispersant on the list.
And in my opinion, we don't want to use anything that's going to make the situation worse. And in my opinion, we don't want to use anything that's going to make the situation worse.
How poisonous is it?
Any living organism that contacts this stuff, particularly the mixture of dispersant and oil, is at significant risk of acute mortality that's dying quickly, or sublethal chronic injury that might take weeks, if not months, if not years to manifest.
And this dispersant has been tested. It was approved for use in exactly this area from the surface, for surface application. It was approved by the federal government and the states.
But ma'am, they weren't using it at the surface.
Well, they have been using it. The 600,000 gallons has been dispersed at the surface. They've dispersed another 50,000 gallons or so in the subsea, and that was after testing.
Why was it banned in Great Britain, and why are you no longer using it? Why was it banned in Great Britain, and why are you no longer using it? The BP is just running roughshod over us. Their administrator, their chief executive has said things that have turned stomachs in this country. He's talked about the volume of water versus the volume. You've heard it all. Then the other day, a CBS News crew is at a beach where his oil is polluting our shores, and the Coast Guard comes up and says, these are BP's rules. You can't take pictures here under threats of arrest. This is still America, isn't it? Is somebody going to put BP in line?
Listen, Shep, you're not going to hear me defending BP, who may be responsible for the worst environmental catastrophe this country has seen. You're not going to hear that from the head of the EPA. What I will say is this. We have one other responsibility, and that is to make sure that people are safe. There's a lot of workers out there, and one of the things we want to do is make sure folks are safe. That's not to say, I believe that OSHA has now stepped up their work to make sure that whether folks are working on the boats, whether we're talking about fishers or shrimpers, or even people on land. I will say EPA has been monitoring air since April 28th. That data's up on our website. There are particulate matter, H2S, and VOCs. We haven't seen anything to date on the shoreline that leads us to be concerned. There's monitoring of workers, but that's OSHA's responsibility, and my understanding is they are on the case.
81 days in, with BP still using dispersants, the first glimmer of the price that will be paid. 20%. 1 out of 5 cleanup workers working offshore have been exposed to potentially hazardous levels of a toxic chemical found in those dispersants. Almost immediately, BP began using dispersants that were more toxic than others approved for this use. Dispersants it bought from a company with ties to Exxon and BP. Dispersants it used even after the EPA told it not to.
Some dispersants are safe. Corexit is not. BP said it used the chemical because it was the only one in large enough supply.
And it seems to me that we owe the American people, and certainly the people of the Gulf, better information than that.
You know, BP and all the companies working down there know that there's a more effective, less toxic dispersant available. It's called JD2000, which is much more effective on South Louisiana crude oil and much less toxic than either of the Corexit products they're using. They should have had stockpiles of that ready to go instead of this Corexit product. They knew this long ago. Why they didn't is, I guess, a big question.
Safety measures that could have prevented this were not in place. It's time for our government to step up to the plate and take responsibility for what's happening on the shores of our country.
Some dispersants are safe. Corexit is not.
We have a lab, EPA does, in Gulf Breeze, Florida, and we're going to set up a series of toxicity tests, biodegradation tests, to look at what's going on out there now.
EPA testing released today indicates that where dispersants had been used, 25% of all organisms living at 500 feet below the surface died.
The EPA has issued a deadline to stop using it and to come up with a safer alternative. What safer alternative are you going to come up with?
Well, the EPA did ask us, and in fact I should stress we've been working with them for a while to see are there alternatives to use. We have met the deadline, which is to do some analysis and feedback to them. We did that last night at about 9:30. Right now we cannot identify another product that is available that is better than the Corexit product, but we continue to look at that, and we formally replied to the EPA's request last night. But we'll continue to try to find something better than what we're using, but so far we haven't been able to do that.
BP's response to the EPA and the Coast Guard basically said, to their directive to find a less toxic dispersant within 3 days, they basically said, no, we're going to keep using Corexit 9500. And in their letter, there were not only typo errors and factual errors, but there was a significant omission, and they actually identified a less toxic, more effective dispersant, JD2000. And in their letter, there were not only typo errors and factual errors, but there was a significant omission, and they actually identified a less toxic, more effective dispersant, JD2000. And in their letter, there were not only typo errors and factual errors, but there was a significant omission, and they actually identified a less toxic, more effective dispersant, JD2000, that should be used here if they had it, but they don't. So yeah, it's a real calamity certainly going on. Let me also just say that Tony Hayward's statement about this oil spill only going to cause a very, very modest damage is one of the most arrogant and ignorant statements I have ever heard a corporate CEO say in the midst of a crisis like that.
The government, both EPA, NOAA, etc., have been sock puppets for BP in this cover-up.
EPA is responsible for managing the product schedule of dispersants available for use in spill response and cleanup efforts. But decisions for their use are made by the Coast Guard.
But the Coast Guard are not scientists. They are not scientists. They're under the Department of Homeland Security, which means they are protectors. So how would they know whether your idea was good or not when you are the idea basis? And Mr. Green's science, combined with you, are the repository of scientific knowledge in these fields.
So I would not know, and I'm not an attorney, but...
No, but you are the head of EPA, so if you said, Admiral Allen, we're now heading into a danger zone, or a flashing yellow light so significant, better be safe than sorry, I'm going to either ban or limit the use of dispersants. Could you have the power to act unilaterally?
I believe I do, Chairman, but I do want my lawyers to get you a response.
I know, but that's a question you needed to know from day one, Ms. Jackson.
We clearly have the authority to order them to switch or to order them to use dispersants at a much lower volume. They are doing that. They haven't sprayed, I think, in 5 or 6 days they have not sprayed dispersant. That's through constant management of the operational processes.
To date, none of the seafood samples analyzed for these compounds have concentrations that exceed EPA's and FDA guidelines, ensuring seafood reaching the marketplace is safe to eat.
But I also want to acknowledge the role of NOAA. They are, by law, scientific advisors to the Coast Guard. That is their job.
Madam Chairman, thank you. Just very quickly, one last question for you, Dr. Robinson. With the testing that NOAA has done on the issue of dispersants, in this seafood, have you detected anything that is noticeable or reportable in the seafood that you've been testing?
Our seafood tests are for oil and it's what is dispersed oil. Our protocols are not specifically looking at dispersants or the byproducts of dispersants themselves. Are
you intending to do that?
I think that would be an excellent thing for us to consider, as we've learned from this situation that there are other potentials here, perhaps even about accumulation of dispersants and their byproducts into seafood. As we've learned from this situation that there are other potentials here, perhaps even about accumulation of dispersants and their byproducts into seafood. So that's something we have on our list of things that we would like to know more about.
Is FDA testing this? You know, we were talking earlier about the FDA role with the states in those areas 3 miles within our shores. Are they testing for dispersants?
I don't think that the protocols presently call for the testing of seafood with regard to seafood safety for dispersants or dispersants byproducts. It's really the oil that we're, and the oil byproducts that we're looking for in seafood at the moment.